Okay, so what I'd like to talk about a little bit is how business is thinking through blockchain, because I do a lot of presentations the other direction. I spend a lot of time talking about Ethereum and cryptocurrency and open blockchains to enterprises and business and central banks and corporates. But I don't spend a lot of time going the other direction, so I wanted to try to feel free to ask questions as we go, or let me know if you know all of this already. But one way to phrase this is that blockchain, quote unquote, has brought a lot of, quote unquote, new ideas to the C-suite. So here are some of those ideas, right? Now, some of these ideas or technologies they're not really new, right? And depending on where you've worked, if you've worked in distributed systems or if you've worked in information security, you are probably familiar with them already. But a lot of the times, these things or these words are relegated to people that work down in the basement somewhere of what we would call the cybers, right? So what blockchain, quote unquote, has allowed is a renewed interest or an initial interest in people at the top of the house at very, very large firms around the world to figure out what this stuff means. There's also new things here, you know, when you're talking about crypto economics or some things that are more specific to blockchain systems that really are new, and so they're learning these things for the first time. So there's a lot of, I think, I don't want to say mistrust, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it is that businesses are thinking about when they're thinking about blockchain. And when I go the other direction and I talk to people that have traditionally been in information security, and they say, well, why don't you just use a database? You know, it's about getting those people to understand that if we do adopt this kind of technology as the core layer of enterprise infrastructure in the future, that we're going to need to support that in the same way that we support emerging cloud and other kind of technologies. So in this case, I can tell you that what these people are talking about is it's not that they don't understand what a blockchain is, and it's not that they hate cryptocurrency, and it's not that they really just want a distributed database. And a lot of times it's that they have a business problem and they just don't have the language to truly express what it is that they're trying to solve. And they've read a white paper, they've read some press, and they want to understand it better. So we can be kind, right? So here's what's actually happening. Businesses are experimenting along this kind of spectrum, right? And a lot of enterprise distributed ledger projects probably fall closer to a distributed database. Public blockchain, of course, we're all familiar with. But there's really this kind of fuzzy gray area in the middle. That's what I guess I'd like to call mutualized infrastructure. And if you're familiar with creating a proof of authority network, for example, on a closed parity network, that would be something that you might be able to use for a mutualized infrastructure sort of implementation. You can do the same thing by setting up a vanilla Geth network and with your friends. Now, of course, any of the ether that you would create in that sort of instance has no value on a public market, but you can treat it just, you can do all of the same kind of things on your own test network or your private network that you would do on a public one. So you get businesses that think this is great. We want to make sure that we are only transacting with people that we know, and if we're creating a permission network, we can achieve that, right? So anonymous participation with public, transparent ledgers is really, really a problem for a lot of business processes, especially if you're talking about financial services where you want to handle anti-money laundering and know your customer laws, and at the same time, you have a fiduciary obligation to keep data private. And also, if you're trying to build markets and exchanges, just as we're learning out in the public space, if it's really hard to do that in a private, decentralized, or in a decentralized way without some concept of privacy, with the way that auctions work, right? So every use case kind of falls somewhere along the spectrum, and there's not really a huge push, as far as I can tell, to move core infrastructure of enterprises onto the public blockchain right now. And I think that's great, because CryptoKitties didn't turn out so well for anybody for a couple days. And if you look at the amount of volume of traffic that happens, that comes out of the business world, I don't think we really want anything overwhelming the public network. So that's okay. But in designing future connectivity, what we want to be thinking about is what a network of network looks like. And that it doesn't necessarily have to be all enterprise disaster recovery kind of systems over here and all anti-fragile public blockchain anonymous transaction things over here, but that pragmatically it's probably more likely that we're going to end up with some sort of hybrid network of networks that can hopefully talk to each other. And so developing that kind of underlying standards and the way that can feasibly happen in a technical capacity is something that, for example, the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance has been working on, but also you see technical implementations of whether you're talking about Cosmos or Polkadot or the Interledger Protocol or these other kind of cross-chain projects. So as businesses are experimenting, there are some things that they really like. And specifically here I'm talking about a permissioned blockchain which supports a rigorous or a robust privacy model. But you can share primary records, so a golden copy of something, without necessarily surrendering information ownership to third parties. That's a real business challenge. When people say reconciliation, that's what they really mean, and it really comes down to trust. So this idea that for some reason, because you know other entities in a permissioned distributed ledger or blockchain, that because you know who they are, you somehow trust them, I think is just fundamentally flawed, right? If we trusted everybody else's records, we wouldn't be doing this stuff in the first place. So being able to transact or transmit information without surrendering information ownership is critical. Also, I think we could do a lot to reverse the aggregation and centralization and this creation of data lakes, which over time, especially in a transparent public blockchain construct, are going to at some point become surveillance lakes if we're not careful. So figuring out the way to balance privacy with data transmission is critical, not just for business, but I think also for public endeavors. Also, the way, thinking through how we have historically treated information security and understanding how that could change if we were to use this sort of mutualized infrastructure. So historically, we've always had this: if you're on the outside of the firewall, you're bad. If you're on the inside of the firewall, you must be safe. I think we all know that that's probably not right. And instead, moving to this kind of structure where you have various information security layers and defense in depth really throughout the entire stack. It's a different way to think about cybersecurity. And also just being able to drive adoption of significantly stronger encryption and data privacy standards. You know, if we can actually bring this technology into enterprises because they've been built from the ground up with generally stronger, more modern standards, we can achieve a bunch of things that are on some compliance checklist somewhere about encryption at rest and other things just by using the tech. So all that stuff is very attractive. But privacy, compliance, governance, always a challenge. Dispute resolution, how do you actually integrate this with an existing legal framework? Performance and scalability, settlement finality. You cannot tell a corporate treasurer that their payment was 96% probabilistically settled and may or may not unwind at some point in the future if there's a hostile fork of the network. So figuring out how to work around those things continues to be a challenge. So business is worried about, just went over these, right? Privacy of client data, confidentiality of their business practices, governance. In their context, governance to them means control of the network, so making sure that they don't lose control of what's going on and what's okay, which mostly is because they want to make sure that they can still meet the rules and be compliant with the rules that are imposed upon them. Performance, just meeting the needs of you know, basic doing business. The security we just talked about, and efficiency. So if this isn't better than what you've got today, nobody's going to use it. Make sense? Yes. So it turns out the public networks are worried about the exact same things. So from a privacy standpoint, we're worried about anonymity. What happens to your personal data? What happens if this is stored on-chain and then there is some sort of disclosure event, right? From a confidentiality standpoint, what are the impacts to surveillance in the long term? Governance, in that case, we're talking more about the control of the network evolution and the EIP process, if you're talking about Ethereum specifically. Performance, we all are familiar with the throughput and scalability challenges right now. Security, systemically, and efficiency. Are you going to launch your business here just because it's cool, or is because it's better than what you could be doing with the rest of your time? Is sending a payment through a distributed ledger a better, more cost-efficient way to do it, or not? So maybe these things aren't actually so far apart. It's just that people are trying to solve the problems in different ways. And maybe if we learn from people who have implemented global systems at scale, we could be moving faster. And if they were also listening to some of the challenges that we've had, and you know, things that are actually tested in a hostile production environment every day, we would be building better, more robust systems more quickly. So, enterprise versus enterprise. So, and all credit for this goes to the technical creator of Quorum, Patrick Myland, but Nielsen. But he said, enterprise with a capital E versus enterprise with a lowercase e. It's a subtle distinction. So, Enterprise with a capital E is software that is made for enterprises. That means that it meets some sort of complicated, fuzzy requirements. These are all the stereotypes about enterprise software, right? It's industry-specific, conflicting implementations. You end up with all these bespoke customizations. Different clients are running different versions. You can't ever upgrade things. You have to call someone. There's always a vendor support contract. It's proprietary. It's expensive. It doesn't integrate with things, right? Enterprise software is great. Okay. So that's capital E, enterprise software. And historically, I think when we've talked about enterprise blockchain, this is where people get stuck, and we start creating all of these enterprise clients, and then it looks a lot like existing enterprise software. And not only is it very difficult to attract developer talent to want to work on something like this when you tell them that this is what you're trying to build, when they could be building something that's a lot more like CryptoKitties, but you know, we have a next generation of developers and just people in general that are coming in to work at large companies and large businesses, and they don't necessarily want to continue to use software that looks like it was developed in the 90s. So maybe what we actually mean is that we want enterprise-grade software. So enterprise with the lowercase e. That's software that is actually reliable. Software that has some sort of dedicated development and support team, someone that you can call if you do need help. It works with other software that you're already using. It supports common standards, common languages that you're already familiar with. There's some sort of well-defined APIs and clean interfaces. The deployment model takes into account that not everyone is cloud native all the time. You need to be able to deploy some of these things on premises. There need to be access controls and integration with identity and access management programs. There's also probably ongoing QA, security auditing. It works with your existing tools. It's not just adding massive technical risk if you deploy this thing. And then people can learn about it. There's training. It's not super niche. It's not just like 12 people that know about this, but you can go out in the world and you have some sense that if you build a business critical application on this software, that it's going to continue to be supported in the future. And of course, designed to scale. So we've arrived at Quorum 2.0, which was released in December. That is not to say that I think that Quorum is exactly nailing all of these things, right? That's not exactly the segue I was going for, but rather that there's a difference between building enterprise distributed ledger systems that are meant to always run on a 24/7 uptime, well-supported cloud infrastructure supported by an incumbent technology company, and software that can run somewhere that has power 4 hours a day, and where the regional bank doesn't trust a central bank, and where local people are getting smartphones but don't have any bank accounts. So if we're trying to create an internet of value, it's not just about connecting business to business. At some point, it also has to be about connecting business to consumers. And it's not about just consumer to consumer, or as I like to call them, humans. But we actually want to connect all of these people together and be able to provide not just financial services, but we're talking about, you know, new cottage industries of all the kind of internet of value things that we're moving towards. So if you want to create those kinds of marketplaces that are not simply isolated amongst the people that already have all of the assets in the world, then we're going to need to do a better job of making software work not exclusively for one group or the other, which will continue to bifurcate those power structures, but to actually integrate these things together into one thing. So Quorum is a fork of the Geth client. You can run it it's meant to run in a permission setting, and that's because every node has an identity. They're assigned public-private keys, and you can basically, I'll get into how this works in a second, but you can address a smart contract to any other node in the network. That allows you to have private smart contracts. So what we're trying to solve for is governance, right? So you basically solve for your governance by having your own permission network where you set the rules. You're solving for confidentiality, so there's various privacy mechanisms within the network. And we're trying to solve for some security things. So this gets a little nebulous, but how you're treating consensus on the network. So if you're running within a permission network, you no longer necessarily have to be using proof of work. However, depending on how you expect these things to scale, when you look at supply chain, for example, as a use case, a lot of supply chain use cases started with, you know, five entities, and the network topology looks a lot like ARPANET in like 1970, right? Like you're directly connected to these people and you trust them and everything's fine. But an actual supply chain might contain millions of participants. If you're talking about somebody like, you know, a Walmart or a Home Depot that sits in the middle, or an Amazon, and then you have all of the kind of physical supply chain crossing a financial supply chain that creates this actual way that we move goods and money around the world. Once you have millions of participants in your permissioned blockchain, it starts to inherit a lot of the security properties of a public blockchain. So we can't actually be designing something that will only work, like I mentioned previously, in just that clean, trusted case, which is what a lot of the pilots look like right now. So how do we move towards something that has other properties? So within Quorum, we have Raft, which you can use on your standard kind of closed enterprise system. Istanbul BFT so this is a Byzantine fault-tolerant algorithm, but it also does not require the use of cryptocurrency. It was created not by us, it was created by a startup called Ami, but this is meant to solve network coordination amongst a larger group of participants who do not necessarily trust each other as much. So with Quorum, you end up with, it's Ethereum, but plus permissioning, privacy, performance, configurable consensus, and depending on which algorithm you're using, settlement finality. So that's the goals of the project. What am I doing on time, actually? I didn't bring my phone. Hold on. OK. Just wanted to make sure that I wasn't rambling for 2 hours. OK, so here's the generalized architecture. This is not to scale, right? Like the Geth portion is actually 95% of all the code. It's actually not changed that much. Where it's really been, and that's intentional, right? There's very minimal modification. What has been changed, or what has been added in, is Constellation, which is the privacy, the ability to address these smart contracts around the network, which can keep your business logic private. And then above that, all of your smart contracts would function exactly like they do. Above that, you have your kind of standard dApp layer. You can also work with projects like Web3j, which Connor was in here earlier talking about, which mean that you can write your business applications in Java and things that bankers know and love. We don't necessarily have to treat this like it's completely new software. Okay, so just in the interest of time, I'm going to jump forward. So JP Morgan announced a partnership with Zcash last year at Consensus, and that was not, the goal of that partnership was to pull the zero-knowledge settlement layer, or zero-knowledge security layer, as they had coined it, into Quorum as it became a zero-knowledge settlement layer. So what that is we end up, here's kind of the architectural model, or I guess this is more of a, this is how you can think about it. So you end up with this, in the middle layer there, that's Ethereum. So that's your shared blockchain. Everybody is, you know, you're a node on the network, you're all participating in validation. Underneath that, you have the Constellation network, and that's what allows you to address smart contracts around the network. It's a point-to-point network. It is not a peer-to-peer network. So one thing that businesses are very concerned about is meeting regulation, but any sort of rules about in-country storage of data, right? There's actually rules that say that you cannot transmit encrypted payloads around the world. It's kind of strange if you think about how the internet actually works, but like, don't bog yourself down with these things. So what we end up with, though, is a system where you really don't want to transmit encrypted payloads. You definitely don't want to store them on a shared blockchain, but you also don't want to transmit them peer-to-peer. So by making that point-to-point, you've satisfied that requirement, and you're also able, then you can have your own kind of disaster recovery model around those, the private payloads. But what we critically are doing there is taking a hash of this the encrypted payload and committing that back to the shared blockchain. So everyone does actually validate that portion, right? So it's a quote-unquote known issue right now. There is not consensus over the private state within Constellation, but that is not meant to be that way forever. It's simply a priority roadmap item of resourcing to fix it. There's some designs around it. If you want to talk about that, feel free to corner me later. So what you have then is you have this shared blockchain in the middle, which is basically your event coordination layer. If you were to deploy a basic vanilla Solidity smart contract that did not utilize Constellation, then it would just get deployed in that layer just like now. If you utilize the quote-unquote private 4 that activates Constellation, then those payloads are stored down here. Up on top, that is the zero-knowledge settlement layer, and that is a UTXO model of encrypted, well, cryptographically private ERC20 tokens. So in that case, you can basically, as you're creating a workflow, you have a business process. For example, let's say you have a loan, let's say. and the loan is for like $100 million. So you define that in your private smart contract. That private smart contract issues all your ERC20 tokens, just like you would do in a standard process, but it creates them in such a way that then they sit on the shared ledger and they're shielded. And the only information that is queryable about those tokens would be the amount that they're for and the current ownership. Every other business process that has to do with that loan about, there's like a whole workflow process that goes around originating and then who owns it and how you're handling asset servicing on these things. All that stuff remains private. That means that, very importantly, let me just jump ahead to this one to show that. So you are not running business logic through anything that is zero knowledge. That would be ridiculously, it would be very costly from a gas perspective, but also just take like literally forever. Instead, the only time that you need to call out to the zero knowledge settlement layer is when you are actually affecting an actual asset transfer from person A to person B or wallet A to wallet B. So some of the benefits that this gives us, though, is that you can create actually private secondary markets. So there are requirements that when you sell a portion of a loan forward, the new owner cannot know who previously held it. Right? So the provenance that's considered such a benefit in a transparent public blockchain system actually just really doesn't work when you're talking about how we treat existing financial assets. And there's any number of reasons around that. So what you get is two things that kind of pair off against each other to create this hybrid privacy model. So Constellation allows you to have private smart contract execution, but because they're private, unless you architect your contract in a specific way, you basically would lose the concept of provable mass conservation. Now, you could make it work, but we didn't want to rely on developers to always make it work, since developers occasionally make mistakes. So instead, you can call the very simple ZSL APIs, which will create those tokens and then re-implement all of that for you. So those things kind of pair off together. On the other hand, so we have prevention of double spend requires specific application architecture. Mass conservation comes from ZSL. Private smart contracts on Constellation, but we're not running anything like the EVM through zero knowledge. People tend to be confused about those things, but hopefully that was clear. Okay. So public transactions are broadcast to everyone within the network, just like on regular Ethereum. They're processed there. Right now, we have the concept of gas within Quorum. Gas is set to free. There has recently been a pull request to re-implement the cost of gas. And so I think we're already seeing this evolution towards, as these networks scale, that people actually do want to re-implement some concept of either, I don't want to call it incentives, but at least reputation in some way. You need some way to at least rate limit the network, right? So we're kind of toying around with different ways to do that without making businesses buy crypto assets, which they absolutely still refuse to do. Private transactions then are point-to-point, and a hash of those are included on the shared blockchain. Okay. So much as ZSL is to Zcash, blockchain is to Bitcoin. That's the disclaimer on that. I think we got through that. Okay, so if you're interested in trying out Quorum and ZSL, ZSL is very much a proof of concept. There's a whole other phase planned where we'll address some of the proof malleability, as well as some of the other, all of the performance increases of the Zcash shift to the new jub curves should also kind of flow forward into the ZSL implementation. So we'll see right now, generating that proof does take about 30 seconds. Again, it only happens at the end when you actually move an asset. But that should come down to like 5 to 7 seconds. It's probably worth noting that JP Morgan also worked with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, along with Consensus, to do a second zero-knowledge implementation for a project they were working on. It does not use ZSL. What it does allow you to do is to use a simpler zero-knowledge primitive to shield an account balance within a private smart contract. So it was a slightly different kind of a project, but now we have at least two different ways to think about zero knowledge in this kind of a system. And what you can do there, the reason you would want to do that is if the specific problem or the use case they're working on is called gridlock resolution. And right now, MAS, Monetary Authority of Singapore, sits in the middle of all of their their banking infrastructure. And at various points through the day, they issue these sweeping instructions that clear the gridlock. So like if I owed you 20 bucks and you owed him 50 bucks, but you can't pay the 50 until you get the 20, that's actually centrally coordinated right now. So they wanted to figure out if there was a way to build the same thing, but without that central coordinator. And we were able to demonstrate and do that on Quorum with the privacy features. And because those balances sometimes drop below 0, you would want to use something that looks a lot more like this account balance structure than something that probably looks like the UTXO model of ZSL. So next steps, I think that's the next steps of what we're doing with ZSL. And then, so there's a lot of people that are working with Quorum right now, probably people that you've heard of, like Accenture and Microsoft, maybe other people that you may or may not have heard of, like Chronicled and Amber Data and Block Apps. Amber Data is not my company. It's a reference to, it's a reference to Nick Szabo saying that blockchain was like locking data in Amber. So sadly, whenever they're in the room, though, I tell them they have to tell me it was me. Okay, and then within EEA, there is a Quorum testnet. There's a couple dozen institutions either on there or queued up to join. So people are playing with this stuff. There's also a lot of actual projects and pilots that are happening out in the world, but we don't have time to talk about all of them. So that is a test network. Corporations are actually playing with these things. Thomson Reuters, for example, is actually like publishing a data oracle of market data that you can subscribe to and use within your smart contracts. And like this stuff is real and it is happening. So that's very exciting. And then just to kind of get the imagination thinking, here's something that I've been interested in for the last year or so that I've been trying to get off the ground. We'll see what happens with it long term. But why couldn't we launch something that looks like a public bug bounty program on Quorum, right? So if you were to create a network that becomes something that public, what does public mean? Right? Maybe it's actually, what does semi-public mean? If you can join a Slack channel, for example, but it requires an invite, but all you really need to do is click on a button to get access and register to do that, why couldn't we set up a Quorum network that functions that same way? So in essence, you would register and we would know who you are, and if you do bad things that are outside the bounds of what's allowed in the network, maybe you get kick banned. But you could have somebody that, so censorship resistance, not a thing here, right? But you could also have some sort of either reputation or gas allocation system so that you can let people test out, test various kind of security things there. So I think that would be a really interesting way to kind of play with changing kind of the boundaries around what does a public or a permission network mean. And I don't really think that we're at risk of anybody blowing an actual like Geth Ode on a Quorum network, so I probably don't have to pay anything out on that. Okay, because it would be much more valuable elsewhere. That's the joke. Okay, so to learn more, get involved, you can either there's a variety of websites. I would recommend probably just GitHub is the easiest. Everything that we've built around Geth is Apache for Constellation, MIT for the ZSL layer. The rest of Quorum does inherit the GPL, LGPL from Geth, but it's relatively tightly controlled. So we're trying to keep all of the interfaces around that, probably something slightly more permissive like Apache. And there's also a Slack. I think there's about 400 people on the Slack at this point, pretty active. And finally, never forget that all mentions of #crypto actually refer to Cryptoplitus, the plesiosaur reptile from the Middle Jurassic period of England. So this is how I've rectified people that are upset about crypto, either meaning cryptocurrency or cryptography. That's me. I'm uniting the tribes. So you're all wrong. So at this point, if there's any questions or comments, feel free. We have a couple minutes, I think. Yes. Oh, do we need mics or anything for that?
No, I don't need a mic. Unless
I think for the live stream, they want a mic.
Thank you. Why did you guys choose to go with zero knowledge CK snarks as opposed to ring privacy?
Sure. I mean, ring signatures being a method of obfuscation and not encryption. I think we were trying to see if we could actually play with ZK snarks because they're considered kind of the best-in-class privacy solution. There are other enterprise Ethereum-focused platforms like Clearmatic's platform Photon that are looking at that, and I don't think that in the long run they're necessarily mutually exclusive. This, also, there's a bit of a just pushing the envelope kind of thing of sitting in a lot of rooms where people say that privacy is going to come from SGX or something else, and saying, no, we're going to do it with applied cryptography here, and let's prove that we can make this work. I don't know when these things are in production at scale what they will exactly look like, and if this is the end-all be-all of privacy forever. That's not the goal. But to prove that we could get large businesses behind using this, and they are, that's just, it was worth proving out.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. You just mentioned that Quorum is kind of enterprise-grade Ethereum. So, question is it a project that is promoted by Ethereum Enterprise Alliance? Is it who is making the support of this product? Will it be licensed in the future, and all this?
I wish I had answers to all these questions. I mean, running, and I didn't get a lot of time to talk about this, which I said I was going to on Twitter, but running this project or an open source project within a highly regulated entity has been a huge learning experience. I mean, JP Morgan did not have a GitHub presence before this, had never really open sourced anything that was a real community project. And there have certainly been challenges in doing that, but it's also been great to have that kind of support. So it's kind of goes together. I think the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is a standards body. They do not own code at this point, and there are a variety of enterprise Ethereum or enterprise clients that aim to be enterprise grade within EEA. So Quorum is just one of them. It's always been my personal opinion, which others may or may not share, but that any individual client isn't going to win the market by excluding others or being named the thing on day one. It's about people wanting to use it and people wanting to develop on it. So I don't think there's a need to do that. That said, what EEA is working on is a technical specification for what Ethereum should look like if enterprises can use it. And any client that exists within EEA should be able to be either certified, EEA compliant, or say that they meet 80% of these things or whatnot. So there has been a lot of work in the last year to make that spec exist. And I'm hoping that it will be publicly available soon. But my personal feeling on this, as I hopefully came throughout the presentation, is that I really don't know if enterprise anything needs to exist. What we need is the internet as the internet exists that can be used for personal use or business use, but you use a variety of features if you are running a high security kind of a business. I feel like that's the direction that we should be going with an enterprise Ethereum client, but we're simply not there yet. And it's a little bit like VHS Betamax, I guess, but I feel like in the next year or so, there's simply no way that the market is going to support the number of clients that exist and are available. So some consolidation is inevitable. And who supports it right now? There's a bunch of people in the Quorum working group at EEA. There's the 400 people in the Slack channel. There's the actual tech team at JPM, which are basically like L3 support if something is on fire, because it's a very small team. But there's also if you have a larger business like Accenture, Wipro, Infosys, Synchron, like all these companies, Consensus, they all are doing paid engagements supporting Quorum. Yeah. Wait for she's going to give you the mic for you.
Just that if Ethereum could learn from some of the privacy mechanisms that you've deployed without some kind of political trade-off.
What do you mean by
in
political
terms
trade-off?
of trusted setups?
Well, okay. So the Powers of Tau thing is happening now, and we're participating in that, we being like me on my personal time, and Patrick. So I think some of the concerns about the trusted setup hopefully will go away in that sense if you believe in the new mechanism of the new ceremonies. I think, you know, what Ethereum integrated with adding like the zero knowledge primitives last year is a good step. What ZSL has been is an application that actually functions, like it's an application of that technology. And what you can learn from that, I think, is that the governance of public Ethereum being necessarily slower and more considerate and involving thousands of participants means that nobody can just say, hey, we're going to do this thing. And we're doing it because I said so, right? And that's great for public Ethereum. For Quorum, we were able to say, why don't we see if this can work? We're just going to do it. And we believe that the trusted setup is fine, or I guess, as we say, initializing parameters or something that's not so polarizing as trusted setup. So if you believe that that setup is flawed, there's nothing I can do to like fix that for the public Ethereum community. That's like a religious debate. Was that an adequate answer? Okay. Good. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, sorry, one more. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Will it be able to scale as fast as Ethereum when Ethereum scales?
Yes, yes. So one of the really good things about staying close to Geth is that we inherit almost all the benefits of both security advancements and scaling advancements. Now, one thing that's interesting is that some applications of Quorum that I hear about now are people that want to run Quorum almost as sidechains to public Ethereum. And they'd like to do something that might be too expensive to run on the public chain, or they maybe just want to be masters of their own universe and be the only ones that are allowed to deploy a smart contract because they're building a video game or something, and they want to let people that want to play their game onto that network, but nobody else. And then maybe you commit the results of the outcomes of your games back to the public chain. Like, people are thinking a lot more flexibly about these things. And so in the same way that we benefit from the scaling efforts happening right now, and there are several of them I could probably talk to you more privately about. I don't know if we're ready to broadcast them all over the world. But in the same way that we benefit from that work, the public chain also can benefit if we're able to communicate back and forth, as some people are working on. JPM not doing that development work, but others are, that Quorum, or it doesn't have to be Quorum, literally any private networks could help also scale public Ethereum. Okay, that was good. If you have other questions, feel free to grab me after the fact. I think there's drinks tonight and whatnot. So thank you very much.